G'day everyone, I'm Ebony Bennett. I'm Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and welcome to Pole Position, our fortnightly show where we unpack the big political issues and dive into the latest political polling trends from the fortnightly Guardian Essential report. Before we start, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I live and work on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country here in Canberra and pay my respects to elders past and present. The Australia Institute does like to do these webinars at least weekly, but the days and times do vary. So please head on over to australiainstitute.org.au/events to register. Don't forget to register for next week's webinar, where I'll be talking to ACT Chief Minister Andrew Barr about pandemic leadership. That should be a great one. So tune in. And as usual, it's been an extremely quiet fortnight in federal politics. We've seen the Prime Minister out today effectively on the hustings, what feels like the beginning of a federal election campaign, even though that could stretch out until even perhaps May next year. He was doing announcements today around charging infrastructure for electric vehicles, just a few years after he rubbished them and said they would end the weekend. He's obviously still dealing with the fallout of the French president calling the Prime Minister a liar. That was while he had his most recent overseas trip where he went for the G20, which got rather overshadowed by the French president, as well as obviously attending the Glasgow COP26. So we're going to dive into a lot of stuff here today. Never a lack of news around here. Just a few tips before we begin to help things run smoothly. If you hover over the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should be able to see a Q&A box. You can type in questions for the panel there and upvote questions from other people, as well as make comments as well. Please keep things civil and on topic in the chat, or we'll boot you out. And lastly, a reminder that this discussion is being recorded, and if you have to duck out for any reason, it goes up on our website and our YouTube channel. So to discuss the very quiet fortnight in federal politics that we've had, we're delighted to welcome special guest Sarah Martin, Chief Political Correspondent for Guardian Australia. She's filling in this week for Catherine Murphy, our regular panelist. And a big welcome to Pete Lewis, Executive Director at Essential Media, Richard Dennis, Chief Economist at the Australia Institute, and John Remmington from Essential as well. Welcome, everyone. Sarah, I'll let you do the honours. Just for people who have been under a rock somewhere, do you want to just maybe cover the highlights of the last couple of weeks in federal politics for us?
Sure, although we've only got an hour, right? Like that's the limit. Look, I should firstly point out that the reason that I'm filling in for Murph is that after covering the past 2 weeks, including going to COP and the G20 with the Prime Minister, poor Murph is probably either staring at a wall or collapsed in a heap somewhere. So I'm very happy to be here to give her a bit of a rest. It's been an incredible fortnight, and it's kind of shocking to think that it was just a fortnight ago that the Prime Minister was standing up here in Parliament House announcing that they'd reached an agreement with the Nationals on net zero by 2050 and releasing the Australian Way plan to reach that target. Since then, we've obviously had all the fallout that came with that plan for its obvious lack of detail and policy substance. And then Morrison heading to the G20, where he was hoping he could spin this as somewhat of a victory for the Australian government. And the trip was then not only overshadowed by, I guess, the criticism for Australia's climate policy, but also, of course, the quite extraordinary diplomatic fallout with the French, and particularly the extraordinary tit for tat with Emmanuel Macron, who accused the Prime Minister of lying to him, and then, of course, Morrison returning fire with a very juvenile, well, he started it, and leaking the text messages from the French president. So it's been a quiet couple of weeks, and now he's back and is definitely on the hustings, and we've seen, I guess, a taste of things to come with Morrison's messaging on the ground since he returned. A lot of choices, not mandates, technology, not taxes, spin, not substance is where we're at the moment. So it's been a busy couple of weeks.
And it looks like it's going to be a long federal election campaign as well.
I think today that dawned on us that, oh my goodness, is this, like, if we have an election in March, we've got 4 more months of this. If it's May, God help got 6 more months of this. So yes, it's going to be a long campaign either way.
Yeah. Before we get stuck into the polling results, Richard, COP20 was supposed to be a big political triumph for the PM, getting net zero by 2050 over the line, but it didn't really work that well. What's been some of the fallout from COP26 for the Prime Minister?
Well, again, let's go back a few weeks with people wondering whether it was a good idea for Prime Minister Morrison to go overseas or not. It's hard to imagine it could have been worse if he stayed at home. Look, we're used to the idea that taxpayers would spend millions of dollars to help, with polling and message testing for a government. But we've never seen a situation where a government has spent billions of dollars to buy the votes in the parliament needed just to use a slogan like net zero for 2050. And while that was written up as a sort of stroke of genius here, finally bringing the coalition together, it was seen for what it is overseas. And that was a vacuous statement from a government that's actually committed to digging new coal mines, opening new gas basins, and building a new gas-fired power station. So I think it's a kind of a bit of a revelation for Australia to see how we're seen on the world stage, and that what passes for sophisticated kind of spin and politics here is just flicked away by people from Emmanuel Macron to Lord Deben, Boris Johnson's senior advisor on climate change. So I think Australia has really lost a lot of credibility. And it's not an accident that what happened with the submarines has affected what's happened with climate change, because it is about trust. It is about making promises and sticking to them. And Australia is being seen as a bad actor on both fronts, and not just by the countries that are directly affected. Everyone's looking and seeing just how unreliable Scott Morrison is. And just very quickly, remember that text he leaked? The one where Macron said, "So is it good news or bad news?" That was the most embarrassing text the Prime Minister could find when he went through his whole phone. The one that actually proved that Macron didn't know whether it had been cancelled or not. So, I think, again, a lot of people internationally just thought, wow, what is that about?
Yeah. Sarah, just coming back to you briefly, that really did strike me as something I've rarely seen world leaders do. And it seemed a fairly big step to go to kind of combat this idea that Morrison was a liar, even though he tried to say the French president was kind of maligning the whole of Australia. Do you think this is going to be an ongoing problem Labor's certainly trying to make it a problem for the Prime Minister's character overall. Do you think that will stick?
Oh, look, I think it absolutely is a problem, because it sort of confirms people's suspicions about his character. And obviously character is a very important thing in politics. Timing wise, it was quite interesting because we had the French ambassador to Australia speaking at the National Press Club last week. And he sort of made the very obvious point that what world leader is going to trust their private communication with the Australian Prime Minister after this extraordinary leak. And I know you say it's something you've rarely seen, but I don't think it's something we've ever really seen happen. I certainly have never seen it before, and it was certainly a shock to people who've covered politics for a lot longer than I have. So I think it is damaging. I think he made the calculation that, to win the sort of short-term political cycle, it was in his benefit for a domestic audience to leak that message. But I think it was a very intemperate and undiplomatic thing to do. And I just can't see how that doesn't further confirm people's suspicions about the Prime Minister's character, which or is already under a cloud. And you saw Labor come out really strongly on the weekend, calling the Prime Minister a liar in a very forthright manner, which we also haven't seen previously. So yes, absolutely, I think this is a problem for the Prime Minister, and it goes to the heart of his character.
Yeah, and we even saw senior government ministers kind of attacking journalists for asking questions of the French president. Like, it's been quite an extraordinary response, all in all. Pete, these character issues, are we seeing this come through in the polling? Shall we head on over to the...
Yeah, look, it's really interesting this week. And the way I look at it is very much the case that chickens are coming home to roost on the Prime Minister. This is really interesting, the approval of Morrison over the last couple of years now. We remember the 2020 bushfires where he appeared cooked, 49% disapproval, 41 approval after, Hawaii and forced handshakes back then, if we remember, down in Cobargo. The pandemic was a period where we put faith in our leaders, and he wore that mantle to his benefit. Approvals into the mid to high 60s, and now back to the lowest level since what appeared at the time to be the fatal summer for him. You never know where things go over the next little period, but those trend lines are not great for him. Like in contrast, Anthony Albanese is remarkably stable, and there is a sense that Labor has been in a holding pattern, circling the airfield, at least since the pandemic began. I guess the question is what it looks like once they start landing the plane, which they inevitably need to do as we move towards the election. The Prime Minister is still ahead as preferred Prime Minister. The only time that hasn't occurred was back in the bushfires. So again, there's still a fair bit to be played out in terms of the head-to-head leadership struggle. But this is interesting. Well, this is kind of the classic pollster's question, which takes it out of the party political. Does a party deserve to be re-elected, or time to give someone else a go? And that's trending up. 45% now. Obviously, the law of averages says they need 6% more, and they're home. And I know the world doesn't work like that, but I do think Morrison's come back a diminished figure from his time away. I've just put up a piece on Guardian where I sort of unpack the Australian way as his brand. People will remember that before he got into politics, he branded Australia in a different way. Where the bloody hell are you? And I did spend the weekend reading Sean Kelly's really good book called The Game, which I can really commend to people who makes, and I'm sorry to sort of stay on this for a minute too long, but he makes the point that Morrison has been a master at created a flat character, where we understand Morrison initially when he became Prime Minister through the fact that he cooked curries for Jen and the kids and he supported the Sharkies. And so out of the corner of your eye, you thought that this was a guy that understood me, who was authentic. I reckon he's trying to do the same thing with climate now, which out of the corner of your eye, net zero by 2050, embracing electronic vehicles, forget what I said in the past. It's that really light touch, flat politics that he's trying to hold on to. And, he succeeded in doing it once. His only problem is the other bit of the flat character now is don't hold a hose, mate. It's not a race. The French reckon you're a liar. So to Sarah's point, I think this does hurt him long term, but this is the first in what will be an ongoing data set in terms of whether Morrison's cooked or whether he can bounce back yet again.
Yeah, I can see we've got more than 700 people online with us today. Thanks so much for joining us. Just a reminder, you can type questions into the Q&A box for the second half when we go to questions from the audience. Sarah, I wanted to come back to you briefly. The last couple of weeks too, we've had a much greater focus domestically around integrity and the need for a federal independent commission against corruption, or some kind of integrity anti-corruption body, with two state bodies, the New South Wales ICAC and Victorian IBAC, looking into various scandals at the state level. And it's really shone that spotlight, specifically in light of that 60 Minutes investigation into Michael Sukkar and branch stacking and the misuse of money in politics. Do you think this renewed focus on integrity again is going to be more kind of lead weight in the Prime Minister's saddlebags, or do you think we'll kind of move on to other things?
Well, it's a really good question, and the Commonwealth Integrity Commission is supposed to come up and be introduced into Parliament in the final 2 sitting weeks of this year. Now, this is something that was promised before the 2019 election. There's been, there's been a friendless exposure draft released for consultation. It was a process that the former Attorney General Christian Porter really sat on and didn't advance, and now the new Attorney General Michaelia Cash is trying to work through it, but we know there are Liberal MPs who want it to go further than it currently is. It's been sort of condemned as lacking teeth, as been sort of fairly impotent as far as the scale of the various corruption bodies across the country go. At the same time, we've had Helen Haynes introduce her proposed Federal Integrity Commission into the lower house, and Rex Patrick has introduced that bill also into the Senate. So that has also sort of heaped the pressure on the government to actually do something about this. My understanding is that the bill that is yet to go through Cabinet will probably toughen up some elements of the previous legislation. But it's unlikely to go far enough, and it's still likely to attract criticism. So I guess that it's going to be an interesting test for the government, whether or not it actually presents a bill to Parliament that sort of addresses the concerns that people have about integrity in federal politics. There's obviously been a big issue that we're all aware of in terms of the sort of declining trust in federal politicians and federal Parliament as an institution, and you'd think that something like this would go some way to restoring some of that trust. But the other interesting element, I guess, to this is that particularly the ICAC hearings in New South Wales, where obviously Gladys Berejiklian has been giving evidence regarding her relationship with Darren Maguire, that has actually hardened the resolve of some Liberals against a integrity commission that holds, for example, public hearings. So there is there are some mixed views within the coalition party room on what a Commonwealth Integrity Commission should look like. So yes, the final sitting fortnight of Parliament is going to see this issue front and centre, I suspect. And then it's also going to be a question of what happens when the legislation is in the Senate, whether or not it is good enough for the crossbench to support it in the event that Labor and the Greens oppose it. Are they going to decide that something is better than nothing, or are they going to, continue to argue that only a Federal Integrity Commission with teeth is worth pursuing?
Yeah, we might go back to the slides now. Pete, going back to this issue of trust, do you want to walk us through what we can see here?
Yeah, John will probably help me here a bit too. So we do a benchmark regularly on trust to handle different issues. And I think what's really interesting in this slide is home turf for a coalition government is national security and the economy. They've gone from +13 2 months ago to +6. That's after they've announced a subs deal, a groundbreaking new alliance with the old white guys, and it was meant to give them the sort of advantage that would be their second leg of re-election, given that who's managing the economy is always their first leg. So you see there's been a real deterioration there, but on trust to maintain international relations, they would not normally sit in the negative either. So that shows the effect of 2 months of geopolitics led by Scott Morrison. Basically 1 in 12 Australians shifting their view. Like, they're the sort of numbers that, if there is salience in those issues, changes elections. Before we go to that one, John, and you'll help me out here, there were a number of other trust issues that we haven't put in the slides, but on the economy, I think the government's still plus, but it's under 10 now, which is low for the government. And I think there's also health and education.
Yeah, so it's only 3 months. So typically after that time, we wouldn't expect too much of a shift, which is why, as Sarah and Richard have mentioned, the events of COP26 and the AUKUS announcement seem to have really resonated with those two issues. Management of the economy has slipped. So there's less than 10 percentage points difference between the Liberals and Labour. It's now 8 though, so it's only 1 or 2. it's national security and international relations where we have seen that big shift over the past few months.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. I just thought we'd add that in for a bit of extra texture for the team today. So a couple of other binary questions we asked on Australia's international reputation and the economy, which is closer to your view that it doesn't really matter, or it does matter, 70-30. So if push comes to shove. And I think the previous one was just more, Ebony, about Scott Morrison's impact on Australia's international reputation. I was joking this morning. I want to do a focus group with the 27% of Australians who think that this trip enhanced Australia's international reputation, because I want to know what they reckon. And but seriously, we're now at a point where 28% of Liberal voters are saying that the Prime Minister undermined our international reputation. Normally when a leader is abroad, whether we vote for them or against them, we tend to see them reflecting our interests. The Australian way does not seem to be a reflection of our interests. And I think that's a really concerning number for him there.
Can I just jump in there for a sec? I agree with everything Pete just said. And I think back to when John Howard was first elected, he was often criticised in Australia by progressives for kind of being, out of step on the national stage, on the international stage. And, he got into all sorts of diplomatic problems with Malaysia and Singaporean leaders. But every time he picked those kind of fights, he really kind of spoke to a whole bunch of Australians where he was standing up for us on the international stage. And of course, what Morrison just did was literally the exact opposite. When Morrison was attacked by Macron, Morrison hid behind us and said, don't pick on us Australians, when everyone heard that it was him. So Howard used some blunt diplomacy to actually define himself, whereas Morrison, used some blunt cowardice to conceal himself.
We might go back to the slides again, just to get through the net 2050 ones that we've got here, net zero by 2050. Pete, do you want to just walk us through this one?
Yeah, so this is a question on the net zero target. Is it enough, or should we do more, or don't we know? You can see that 37% is a base, but far more people want to see a bit more action than the Prime Minister is offering up there. So again, it doesn't appear that he's totally landed this. The other slide, though, I think is really important in terms of the plan. 21% believe that the Australian way sets the clear target and provides a credible plan of how to get there. 36% say there's a target but no plan, and 22% it neither sets a clear target nor provides a credible plan. So there you've got 58% going, well, this isn't going to get us all the way. So again, I think it talks to that flat politics. While if you just put the number out there, net zero by 2050, people go, yeah, okay. Once you ask, so what is the plan to get there? That's where he's really struggling. I suspect part of his quite bizarre embrace of electric vehicles today is recognition of that.
Yeah, Sarah, coming back to you, there really wasn't, for all the fanfare leading up to it, for how long we had to wait for that deal with the Nationals, there wasn't a lot of there when it came to the actual national plan and how we're going to reduce emissions. Are we still expecting more detail, or is that going to be it?
I wish they have sort of said they'll release some of the modelling from the department that underpinned the plan, but you're right, there wasn't much to it. And I guess the issue has always been that the net zero by 2050 commitment is really just the sort of supposed to be the starting point. 130 odd other countries had already committed to that. It sort of shows you, I guess, the difficulties of the internals within the coalition that caused such a furor. The Nationals literally lost their minds over nothing. There was nothing in that policy document for them to lose their minds over, and yet they almost brought down the government. So I think there's sort of two things to keep in mind. One is obviously that what they have announced gives us no sort of change of policy. I mean, the government says it relies on existing policies. There's actually no framework for us to achieve that net zero by 2050, other than the sort of technology, not taxes. We're going to spend money on technology. But at the same time, I think it's also, it's just the political reality that it would have been extremely difficult for Morrison to go any further than that, because look at the history of climate policy within the coalition over the past decade. So, if he'd actually tried to do anything of substance, heaven forbid, what would have happened? What would have been the political consequence for him internally? So, unfortunately, that's sort of the sad reality within the coalition.
Yeah. Richard, before we kind of, I guess we'll come back to COP26 again and net zero, but you've written a lot in this issue of the Monthly about the Prime Minister's track record on another issue, which is the COVID pandemic response. Do you want to just take us through what some of the points you made in that essay and why they might be relevant as we head to the federal election?
Yeah, absolutely. And they fit with what Pete was saying about this kind of flat image that people have of Morrison. And the reality is people have populated their own flat image with these handful of really standout things. One is, of course, that don't hold a hose, and the other is it's not a race. And yeah, I've written a piece in this month's Monthly where, for my sins, I literally went and read every speech and every press release the Prime Minister put out, and just trust me, if you read it, I don't make you read it all, but I had to set it out chronologically to try and get my head around it. And I found something that I guess I suspected, and that was the reason it's so hard to understand and remember what happened was that he just kept changing the goalposts throughout. And in New Year's Day this year, New Year's Day 2021, the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald quoted Prime Minister Scott Morrison saying he would rather have a slow, targeted, safe rollout than a quick one, even if that meant longer lockdowns and even if that meant borders stayed closed for longer. That was January. Then he said we were all going to be, all of us, every adult was going to be vaccinated by October. That was last month. Now, it's great that we've hit 80%, but let's be clear, this guy promised us 100%. And, of course, he said it's not a race. And then when he was challenged on that, he said, I didn't mean the vaccine. I wasn't talking about the vaccine. You misunderstood me. That's on you. What I was talking about wasn't a race to approve them. It wasn't a race to approve them. But literally, when he said it wasn't a race, the vaccine, Pfizer and AstraZeneca, had already been approved. So he gaslit the nation for a year, and he just kept shifting the goalposts and shifting the blame. And I don't think anyone is going to remember him as the hero of COVID. All he can hope is that he's moved the debate on. And just to close the circle, like Pete's numbers before on national security are quite interesting. But let's go back to when the subs deal and AUKUS was announced. The whole reason he did that was to shift the debate from COVID to the strong ground of national security, but he bollocksed it up. So, he's always moving. He's always moving. The last thing he ever wants to do is be asked questions about what he said he'd do. His whole strategy is just to say, that's so yesterday, look at this big new thing. That's why he reneged with the French. He wanted them to attack us. He wanted to be friends with America, and that blew up in his face. So I think there's a lot to be learned about Scott Morrison in looking at how he handled a specific crisis that was specifically in his wheelhouse, and that was COVID. And then, of course, with AUKUS and submarines, who's he going to blame a failure in foreign policy on? The state premier? Labor? How does he shift the blame for this? It's impossible.
Can I just say, Ebony, the other part of the whole Morrison strategy is that things are fine. You don't need to change things. It's okay. And if you don't think it's okay, then you're an angry person that isn't part of the mainstream. But if you think things are okay, that makes you mainstream Australia. And I think it plays out in the way we go about climate, the way we talk about gender, the way we talk about any political issue that comes up. Morrison tries to control this. There's nothing to see here, because that then strengthens the case that you don't need to change government if nothing's going wrong.
Yeah, I might go to questions from the audience now, because we've got a bunch that cover all these issues that we've been talking about. Sarah, this first one's going to be from you. For you, it's from Neil Hudson, and he asks, the Morrison government's net zero modelling, does it actually exist? What do you reckon?
Well, something exists. We don't know precisely what form that is in as yet. We know that in Senate estimates, some of the department officials said that they were still working on it to make it easily digestible for lay people, because it was in the form of spreadsheets and so on. So yes, apparently something exists, but we are yet to see it. And the Prime Minister, when he's asked when we will get to see it, basically, pats us all on the head and says, oh, patience is a virtue, all in good time. You will get the modelling when we see fit to release the modelling. But, there has been absolutely no undertaking as to when that will be.
Soon, I hear.
Soon.
Richard, you are a veteran of reading economic modelling of all shapes and sizes. What's your take?
I just love the idea that the modelling in its raw form can only be understood by the National Party and Scott Morrison, but couldn't be released to the likes of me or anyone here. I mean, it's just absolutely ridiculous to suggest that that the modelling that they did kind of can't be consumed by people with less expertise than Barnaby Joyce. So there's that. But I'm actually plugging The Guardian. I got a piece in The Guardian tomorrow, I think, making a slightly different point, and that is that no economic modelling, none, commissioned by any government, has got any idea what technologies will look like or cost in 30 years' time. So we have to be careful here. Don't get me wrong, they should release the modelling. It will be ridiculous. I look forward to pulling it to bits. But it kind of doesn't matter how good it is. Go back 30 years to 1981 and ask economists to forecast the price of a smartphone that hadn't been invented. Or go back to 1981 and forecast the likely price of an electric vehicle versus a petrol car. It is beyond my discipline's capacity to do this. What matters is the goals we set and the things that we start doing today that get us closer to it. And we should look at the modelling. It should inform how they came up with these crazy lack of ambition targets. But no modelling commissioned by anyone, done by any economist in Australia, can help us understand the relative cost of different technologies in 30 years' time.
And just on that, I think in the plan that was released, about 15% of the emissions reduction task was credited to sort of global technology trends, and another 15% to unknown technology
Exactly.
in the future that one day we'll find that out. So how they came up with those numbers is as well is going to be super interesting.
Oh, yeah. I can tell you how they came up with the numbers.
Yeah.
Just sticking with climate for the minute, we've got a couple of questions around it and kind of talking, about how some of this is just a bit useless when we're not actually just focusing on the things that will reduce emissions. Sarah, it's really struck me that this COP in particular has had much more of a focus on reducing methane emissions, phasing out coal. There's much more of a focus on actually phasing out fossil fuels than we've seen at any previous COP. And that, I think, really throws into stark relief the fact that Australia's not doing anything to phase out of anything there. Did that strike you as a real difference this time around?
I think it did, and I think that's also explains why there was so much resistance from the government. Remember, Morrison didn't even want to go because presumably he knew that Australia's position was going to be, it was going to be criticised. And we know, particularly on those two things, methane emissions and on the phasing out of fossil fuels. On methane, particularly, the Nationals extracted a specific commitment from Morrison as part of the negotiations that would not be included as part part of the COP announcement. And, you know, interestingly, Morrison, I don't think the government was ever going to do anything on it anyway, because Morrison was involved in a meeting of heads of government, I think back in September, and interestingly enough, a lot of the talking, the sort of readout of the meetings was released by other leaders, but it seems like Scott Morrison was in the room but didn't actually say anything. So clearly, the methane reductions by 2030 was something that was an absolute no-go zone for Morrison, despite the fact that Meat and Livestock Australia, of course, have a reasonably ambitious policy on the methane front, and despite the CSIRO saying that you can cut methane emissions without actually reducing herd numbers. So, you know, definitely on methane, that was a big part of COP and something that Australia did not want a bar of. And obviously on fossil fuels, you know, Santos was one of the sponsors of one of the pavilion, whatever they're called. Sorry, my brain is just not working at this particular moment, but, you know, a stand in the Australia zone. Santos was a sponsor. So, you know, Australia has shown very little inclination to phasing out of fossil fuels, and I guess that just goes to the sort of hollowness of the plan unveiled by the Prime Minister.
Yeah, Richard, you've obviously done a lot of work on no new coal mines. You did a big piece of work around just the 20 odd coal mines we're planning to open in New South Wales. The question from Rex Singline here was that, you know, net zero and all those things are kind of, they're a target, but they're quite nebulous, whereas literally keeping fossil fuels in the ground is much more specific. How important is this renewed focus around fossil fuels?
Oh, it's very important. And let's go back a step. Like for decades, Australia has got away with going to Kyoto, going to Bonn, going to Copenhagen, and indeed going to Paris, saying, oh yeah, we're willing to commit to vague, abstract things in the future, and we're simultaneously doubling our coal exports and about to become the world's largest exporter of gas. So Australia's got away with this for decades because the kind of the accounting framework that's used at the UNFCCC, the accounting framework doesn't kind of blame Australia for all of the emissions embodied in all of the coal and all of the gas that we export. And in 2015, the Australia Institute really, you know, led the world in calling for a moratorium on no new coal mines. And when I was in Paris in 2015, and President Tong from Kiribati was, you know, a very loud campaigner on that, people were basically saying, no, this is a UN climate talk. We don't talk about coal here. We talk about emissions. And I just trucked around Europe for months with a map showing the 40-kilometre long pits of the Adani coal mine juxtaposed over every European capital city, saying, you know, this is what we're planning to build. And if you don't stop us, we're going to keep going. So I think the world has really shifted between the Paris talks and these talks, and it's left Australia wrong-footed because we show up with ridiculous, meaningless, fraudulent claims like we're going to be net zero and increase coal and gas production. And we're kind of, I think the Australian government's actually surprised that it's copping a shellacking because it's actually got away with this nonsense for so long. You know, so since Paris in 2015, we've opened the Adani coal mine. Since Paris in 2015, we've shot from exporting no gas from the east coast of New South Wales, east coast of Australia, to being the world's largest exporter of LNG. And when we were at Paris, we knew that's what we were planning to do. So yeah, I think Australia's kind of been caught out by the convergence of the global the global negotiation framework, which is all about emissions, with the global politics that are now about the supply side. Australia's the world's third largest exporter of fossil fuels, behind those plucky little countries, Saudi Arabia and Russia. Like, we come third after that, yet we show up saying, oh, but how about net zero in 30 years' time with no policy and us exporting more coal, not less. So We've been caught out.
The next question is about Richard's article in the Monthly, but I'm actually directing this one to you, Pete Lewis. It says, does the panel think that Scott Morrison's re-election campaign will be focused heavily on voters not remembering the actual actions and statements of his government? So we've talked about I don't hold a hose and that kind of thing, but today the Prime Minister was out there kind of, you know, trying to wave away the fact that he thought electric vehicles were going to end the weekend. How much of his election campaign is going to be hoping people just forget about stuff like that?
So my prediction is, if you remember 2019, Labor was running on Labor's team and Morrison was running on Scott Morrison. I reckon this election, the Liberals will be running on Liberals managing the economy, and Labor will be running on Scott Morrison. So I think, no, I'm serious. I think that the one thing that hasn't deteriorated from what we can see is Liberals' brand on economic management. It's narrow, but if you were trying to plot a course for victory, it would be to come up back after summer and say we're going to be hitting some economic headwinds. Who do you trust to manage the economy? Liberals always do better, blah, blah, blah. Labor will be trying to turn it into a referendum on what's happened. Well, I don't think Labor's risk will be to run it on a referendum of what Morrison's done. The point is, because of Morrison's fundamental flaws as a leader and a character, he is not the person to lead us into the future. So I think inevitably every election is about what comes next. This one will be more so. But if I was the Liberals, I'd be making it about the Liberal brand, not about the Morrison brand now. The problem is it's a really thin bench as well, let's face it. And this is a government that was basically the C team after all the sort of test players retired before the last election. So, you know, that was just one man in a baseball cap. Now, if you take the man in the baseball cap out, like, what have you got? Alan Tudge? Like, you know, so this is... So I reckon they've got a hard road to hoe, but I do think economy is what they will try to run on.
I've never heard Alan Tudge's name said with quite that amount of disdain, but
Trying to say, did people see Tudge and the Virginia election in the States? Tudge is trying to get critical race theory up in Australia, and that's the other thing to keep an eye up. Try to create a moral panic, particularly around Indigenous treaty, because white Australian kids should have the right to feel good about their history. He's getting pretty close to what the Republicans are now trialling with some success in the States at the moment. It's pretty horrible.
All right. We'll keep an eye on that one. The next question is, there's two questions that are quite similar from Jonathan Nolan and Ian Paulin around, does the lack of trust overseas actually hurt Morrison at home, or is he using that us against them frame to promote kind of a different message? And is it fair to say that the PM now has kind of form in stuffing up foreign affairs type issues? Sarah, can I come to you on those?
Yeah, of course. Look, I'm not 100% convinced that the diplomatic fracas with France is going to be much of a vote changer. I think if it is a vote changer, it comes back to that issue of, is Scott Morrison a reliable or unreliable character? But I don't think that swinging voters in marginal seats would have paid too much attention to the furor over the cancelled submarine contract. And I think probably Morrison saying, oh, look, we angered the French, but we did this because it was in our national interest to do so, is probably going to be, satisfactory enough for a lot of people. But I think the problem, as we've already spoken about, is that issue of trust, about character, about whether or not, Morrison has a tendency to distort the truth. And I think that is the problematic element of this. And Labor has been very effective in keeping the focus on Morrison's shortcomings, particularly on that front. And it's always been sort of something that people have known about Scott Morrison, that he, a lot of his time in politics has been sort of characterised by that, being loose with the truth. And so that is something that Labor Party identified very early on and has been sort of building up the case and trying to communicate that to, a lot of disengaged voters that there are shortcomings here. So I don't think that Australia's international reputation is damaged sufficiently that that's going to be much much of a vote changer. I think most people would assume that, you know, the French are going to be cranky. Morrison hasn't made any friends, but is that going to be, you know, a vote changer for them? I don't believe it is, but I think it is more of a problem to do with his standing as a individual and his honesty.
I've got a quick one for the panel. Stephen Masters says, when is it most likely the federal election will be held? Pete, what's your tip?
I've been a he'll call on Australia Day for early March guy up until about a week ago. And I just feel like he'll stretch it out as long as he can now and maybe try to pull out another magic budget trick.
Welcome to the May Club, Peter Lewis. I've been in the May Club. I've
just jumped. I have joined you, Sarah. And yeah, it does feel that there's just no turnaround for him coming soon, but we just don't know what summer holds.
Yeah, May election. Your tip, Sarah?
Well, look, I've been in the May Club for quite some time, but I think honestly, I don't think he even knows. Like, I think the reality is that if you aim for a March election and then things are looking a bit shaky, you've got a bit of flexibility to go in May. But if you know, you're not going to lock yourself in to a May election and then remove that ability to go when you think you can win. So I think come Australia Day, if things are looking better and he thinks he can win, then I think he'll go in March, but I think he'll prolong it. And I guess the benefit of a May election, of course, is you can sneak in a federal budget beforehand and use that as a platform for your election campaign, which you know, Morrison has hinted they might do, and Josh Frydenberg has also suggested that might be the way they go.
What do you
now
think,
that everyone's
Richard?
in the May camp, I suspect it'll be a March election.
What about you, Richard?
Well, I'm just going to say, as everyone knows, I ruled out a 2021 election more than a year ago. So happy to see that we're not even bothering with the 2021 election anymore. And yeah, I'm a May kind of guy. A prime minister will go the day they think their chance of winning is never going to get better. He'd go tomorrow if he thought he could win. I just don't think that going early was ever a good idea for him, especially in the middle of a crisis. And I think he needs to leave as much of this as far behind as possible, which makes that, you know, he needs to kind of look like he's running the country, not just running for office again, because really every attempt he's had at running the country's gone pretty badly for him recently.
And I think importantly, we've got to get through the bell curve of the COVID bell curve in Queensland and WA, not only because of the complications going now would have around campaigning, but I think just in terms of getting to the other side, like getting those states to where New South Wales and Victoria are now is really important, because Morrison will find it very difficult to be campaigning as states are going through the peak of that COVID crisis.
Yeah, and can I just say, like, we just shouldn't pretend that that lockdowns are impossible again. In Australia. Like, we have very high vaccination rates. This is good. At the moment, we have low cases. This is good. The way we talk as if we've sorted it, we've been here before, we can look overseas and see what can happen. If people and our leaders lose patience with the non-vaccine control mechanisms, Morrison could be dealing with a health crisis again next year.
That's a good point. The next question is from Martin Johnson. He asks, is the introduction of voter ID requirements, it appears to be a solution in search of a problem, or is it a deliberate tactic to disenfranchise our most vulnerable voters and simply blindly following MAGA Americans? I think that's a reference to Republicans' efforts on voter ID laws and other efforts to disenfranchise voters. Sarah, I'll come to you on that one, voter ID laws.
Look, I think it probably is, if you're going to look at it in the most cynical way possible, which I probably do, I think this can only be seen as a way to perhaps shave a couple of percentage points off the vote in Leichhardt and Lingiari, and I think that's the sad reality that this would have an element of voter suppression, and it's something that Morrison is happy to pick a fight on, because I think on the surface, most people would think that sounds like a reasonable idea, but I think it does have a fairly nasty undertone to it.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the AEC hasn't said that it's a problem. They were more worried about under-enrollment in Aboriginal communities, for example, than there's no widespread voter fraud or anything.
No, the AEC has said, in fact, quite the opposite, that this is not a problem that needs a fix.
Yeah, Pete, is that your reading of it as well?
Yeah, it's a solution looking for a problem. I just think there is a tendency for the US political playbook to be transported into Australia, as we were talking about earlier. I hadn't gone as deeply into the analysis as Sarah's, but that makes total sense.
All right. The next question is from Paul Willie. He says, why has more not been made of the leaking of the classified US document that sought to rebut President Biden's claim that he didn't know the French were told about the impending subcontract cancellation, particularly given the US is our closest and most powerful ally? Sarah, do you want to take that one first?
Oh yeah, that was an extraordinary thing to come out, and the Australian government has sort of said, "Oh, nothing to do with us. Like, go speak to the Americans." We've had, my colleague Daniel Hurst has been chasing this and has had some questions into the US administration, and has also got FOI applications in for the communication plan. So, I think there's sort of two separate issues here. There's one, the need for secrecy regarding the AUKUS deal, which is obviously, understandable, and clearly the Americans would have wanted that to remain under the cone for as long as possible. But then there's sort of the separate issue, which is, of course, the desire by the Australian government to cancel the submarine contract with the French. So I think in the lead up to telling the French that they were cancelling the submarine contract, they sort of conflated that issue with needing to keep the AUKUS deal secret. And there was some debate internally as to whether you could tell the French you were cancelling the contract but not tell them what you were going to do instead of their contract. But clearly the decision was made, and perhaps just as a result of bureaucratic impasse, the decision was made to drop the news both at the same time.
Richard,
we're hoping to find out more about that. I mean, there are attempts underway to try and find out more about that.
Yeah, Richard, it really struck me. I mean, there's nowhere else the leak about Macron's text could have come from except from the Prime Minister's personal phone, presumably. But that leaking against President Biden, again, really strikes me as odd, considering we don't actually have any type of submarine deal inked with the United States and the UK at the moment. To quote Greg Sheridan, which I don't do often, all we've done is cancel the French submarines.
Well, I just think that this leak is just crying out for Phil Gaetjen's attention. I mean, let's be clear. We need to get to the bottom of it. And if Phil's busy, I reckon we get the Department of Finance to have a red hot look at where all of this came from. Look, I just think it's really devastating for Scott Morrison, and in the short term, at least, for Australia on the international stage. Like, everyone knows who leaked these things, and whether Morrison releases information about it or not isn't going to affect how everyone else sees it. There was just a jaw-dropping interview between Fran Kelly and the French ambassador, I'm going to say 2 weeks ago. And I really encourage people to go and have a listen to it. I mean, I've never heard anything like it. But amongst other kind of key points, the French ambassador made the point that as a nuclear power in its own right, with its own deep intelligence and military relationship with the US in its own right, the idea that Australia couldn't trust France with a military or intelligence secret is just absurd. And I really encourage you to listen to the ambassador make this point. It is jaw-dropping radio to listen to. But this is kind of how amateur hour Australian politics has become. We've kind of got journalists running around the gallery saying, oh, of course we had to stab the French in the back. If we'd have told them, they'd have leaked it, because that's what we do here in Australia, and everyone's as gung-ho about this stuff as we are. Well, that is not how the rest of the world thinks this game is played, and that's not how a nuclear power like France is perceived by all of the other countries that Australia would tend to align itself with. And again, to simply suggest that we couldn't trust them with a military secret is absurd.
But if you take a step back, it does feel really Trumpy the way that Morrison does his international relations. Like, line it up, the hits on the Chinese over Wuhan, the hits on the French, the hits on Biden using the Murdoch press, as if that is all justified in the name of domestic political outcomes. And the Trump era has at least gone into the hiatus in the States. But, you know, let's not forget, this is a guy that came to power playing that playbook, and it worked for him in 2019. And I think we're naive if we think just because the American administration changed, Morrison is now a centrist. Like, this guy still plays the politics very much like a populist, with as little scrutiny of what's under the surface as possible.
I agree, but sorry, I mean, we're walking loudly and carrying a tiny stick. You know, it's one thing for Trump to play foreign policy like that. For Australia to do this, again, the rest of the world is just looking at us thinking that we've kind of given up on diplomacy and foreign policy. Because again, as Pete said, because we're just putting domestic political interests ahead of ourselves, and we're not a superpower. Like, it's different when Morrison does this stuff than Trump.
Yeah, and presumably, Sarah, I mean, the French, correct me if I'm wrong, are about to take over the EU presidency. They're obviously huge within the EU already. They're presumably not going to want to do Australia any favours when it comes to things like introducing a carbon border adjustment mechanism and other things. Have we let Morrison shoot Australia in the foot here?
I think that's a really good point. And I think it sort of goes to what Richard was saying. Like, you know, I feel like Morrison has almost picked this fight, but he underestimated who he was picking the fight with. You know, he wasn't picking a fight with Kiribati or, you know, Jacinda Ardern. He was picking the fight with the French, who were very, very well practiced at fighting with Anglo-Saxons. So, you know, I think he underestimated how the French would react to this. And, you know, Morrison was sort of quick to point out that he'd had other constructive meetings with Merkel and with other European powers, and I think you know, this is not going to be the end of the fallout. And you know, clearly Macron is extremely angry with Australia. France is calling for Australia to make demonstrate tangible actions to try and repair the relationship. But I suspect this has some way to go.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry. I feel like we've got loads more questions here, but we've only got a few minutes to go. So we might wrap it up there for today. Again, not a small number of issues happening in politics. Thanks so much for joining us today. We had close to 800 people on the line with us. Don't forget, you can head on over to Guardian Australia to find the latest essential poll results. You can see Richard's issue of the monthly. He's got the cover essay this month about Morrison's pandemic response. I encourage you to check that out as well. And thank you so much for all your wonderful questions. I'm sorry that we didn't get to all of them. Thanks to our panel, Richard, Sarah, John, and Pete. We appreciate your time. Thank you everyone for joining us today. And just that reminder, don't forget, next week we'll be talking to the ACT Chief Minister, Andrew Barr, about pandemic leadership. I imagine we'll cover everything from health policy to the role of government in society, amongst other things. It should be a really good one. And don't forget to check out our Follow the Money podcast as well. We've been diving into Glasgow, COP26, and Morrison's disastrous overseas trip while Ben's been overseas in Glasgow. So check that one out. You can find that on iTunes or wherever you normally listen to podcasts. Take care, everyone. Get vaccinated if you haven't already. I know that's most people in Canberra, but not so great everywhere else. Stay safe out there, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks so much. Bye.
Thanks, Eb.